Good morning, good afternoon, buenos días, buenas tardes. Welcome to this launching of the seminal report of Freedom House, Defending Latin American Human Rights and Democracy Activists. My name is Gerardo Bertin. I am the Vice President for International Programs at Freedom House, and we have prepared a very dynamic launching event for all of you participants. Welcome wherever you're joining us. We had over nearly 300 registrations for this event, and participants are beginning to come in. So before we go into the program, I would like to remind you that this event is actually going to happen in two languages, Spanish and English. Whichever language you choose, there is a little interpretation button at the very bottom of this screen. Este evento se llevará a cabo en español y en inglés. Hay un botón que dice interpretación abajo en la pantalla. This launching event is going to be divided into three parts. In the first part, we're going to have welcoming and introductory remarks. The second part is a panel discussion. And the third part, we are going to open to questions and answers. If anyone in the audience has a question, you can submit your question also in the button that says Q&A. And in the third part of this program, we'll begin to take your questions. So without further ado, I would like to invite Nicole Bivin-Sedaka, our Executive Vice President for Freedom House, to provide the welcoming remarks in this launching event. Nicole?
Thank you, Gerardo. Good morning, buenos días a todos. Es un gusto estar con ustedes hoy día. I'm very, very pleased to be with everyone today and to welcome you to the Freedom House special virtual launch. I wish it were in person, but in these days, a virtual launch of this really important report on defending Latin American human rights and democracy activists. As many of you know, Freedom House is the oldest American organization devoted to the support and defense of democracy around the world. And we work to defend and expand freedom around the world by informing others about the threats and opportunities that exist, mobilizing action to address those challenges, and supporting the courageous human rights defenders that are doing such important work around the world. Our programs support those initiatives that work on human rights and democracy, that promote open government, defend human rights, strengthen civil society, and facilitate the free flow of information and ideas. A crucial aspect of our work is really to create the spaces for dialogue and to provide international platforms to human rights defenders and those who are victims of human rights violations. We are certain that the efforts to combat the abuses of power and human rights violations are about protecting and defending human dignity, and they transcend all politics and ideology. We're preparing to launch our 2022 Freedom in the World report in just a couple weeks. Last year, the same report, which we have produced for almost 5 decades, last year, our report outlined a discouraging democratic outlook for many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. More than half of the countries in this region have seen a decline in civil and political liberties. We categorize countries as free and partially free and not free. There are only 9 countries in the region that are in the free category, 11 that are partially free, and 3, which we all probably are aware of, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, that are in the not free category. And since 2006, Freedom House has seen the greatest decline in freedoms in the Western Hemisphere in both Venezuela and Nicaragua. Human rights defenders and pro-democracy activists are facing extreme challenge in Latin America. And that looks like intimidation, harassment, physical attacks, and legislation that criminalizes their work. And according to human rights organizations and many of those that we partner with, in 2020, Latin America was unfortunately the most dangerous continent in the world for human rights defenders, accounting for more than 3/4 of all the murders of human rights defenders in the world. Imagine that staggering figure and how dangerous it is for human rights defense colleagues to do their very, very important work on a daily basis. And as we all know, and the reason we're on a virtual platform today is the COVID pandemic has touched us all, but it has added extreme uncertainty for human rights defenders and democracy activists, as several Latin American governments have restricted movement and limited freedom of expression and assembly under quarantine regulations. So these worsening human rights conditions have spurred an unprecedented level of migration and displacement, including the human rights defense community. And we've seen that across the region, according to partners at UN High Commissioner for Refugees and IOM, the International Organization for Migration. And many human rights defenders are making the extremely difficult decision to self-exile when they would like to be in their countries and pushing, but they no longer feel safe continuing their work, and they're often forced to flee to bordering countries. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, migrant and refugee populations were especially vulnerable, as border closures and lockdowns have made living conditions even more precarious and curtailed the mobility and access to information and services. So the report that we're launching today is a first of its kind, and it provides the first comprehensive analysis of support and relocation programs of human rights defenders in Latin America, their needs, and the strategies to protect and defend their work. Because this report is extraordinarily important, but it is really a vehicle for us to be doing and thinking about how do we stand with and support those human rights defenders. And it gives us that information that will allow us to do that very important work to stand with them and support them. This report is based on an extensive literature review, nearly 80 interviews with key sources and stakeholders, the analysis of 2 case studies in Venezuela and Nicaragua of the exiled human rights communities in Colombia and Costa Rica, respectively, and Freedom House experiences over the last 2 decades. The report provides recommendations for an effective, realistic, and comprehensive regional approach to defend and protect human rights and democracy activists. And that's the important thing that we want to convey, is it's so important that we have all of this information in one place, because it will provide us with the platform to do that regional approach to defend and protect those activists. Although it's not exhaustive, this report really serves as that starting point to document the trends and identify those potential entry points for new opportunities. I'd love to acknowledge many of my Freedom House team members who produced this report: Jonathan Eloff, Ana Cristina Nunez, Juan Navarrete Monasterio, Ana Quiros Viquez, Gerardo Betin, Alessandra Pina, and Olivia Magnanini. I also want to recognize our other colleagues at Freedom House for their assistance and collaboration in producing this report: Christopher Hill, Caitlin Watson, Sileni Ramirez, Katie Turner, Pablo Leon, Juan Pablo Luque, Jerusha Burnham, Aurelia Nino, and Andrea Martalo. Our entire communications team also has provided invaluable support. And I would be remiss to not also give all of our thanks to the generous support that made this report possible, which was provided by the National Endowment for Democracy. I am delighted that Miriam Kornblith, the Senior Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the NED, at the National Endowment for Democracy, is here with us today, and you'll hear from her shortly. You'll also hear remarks from Mary Lawler, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, and Peter Natiello, the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Latin American Caribbean team. Their presence and their partnership is a testament to the commitment that is shared by so many organizations to be a voice for human rights defender, and their involvement and contribution to this discussion will be so important in addressing and supporting the needs of human rights defenders throughout the region. I hope you'll take away from this report a deeper understanding of the important work that human rights defenders do, their needs as frontline defenders of democracy and human rights, and that it will spur the next step, which is what we're very focused on, which is how do we take all of this knowledge and launch into the partnership to help protect and support these important individuals. And today, as always, our thoughts are with those brave human rights defenders in Latin America and elsewhere as they serve a vital and noble mission. So let me also thank each of you for your participation, and I look forward to a really productive discussion today. Thank you. Gerardo?
Thank you, Nicole, for your welcoming remarks. And as you pointedly mentioned, partnerships is an important part of the work to protect and defend human rights defenders. And we are very pleased to have Miriam Kornblith, the Senior Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the National Endowment for Democracy. And Miriam, welcome, and thanks again for your support to this particular effort.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Muchas gracias. Buenos días, buenas tardes. Creo que voy a hablar en español, considerando que se trata de América Latina. En primer lugar, quiero decir que estoy muy agradecida por esta invitación y sobre todo muy honrada porque realmente se trata de un excelente reporte que pienso yo contribuye significativamente a abordar de manera realista, práctica y efectiva los temas de deterioro de las condiciones de vida, no solamente de trabajo, de los defensores de derechos humanos en la región. Como ya mencionó Nicole y como ya mencionaron Nicole y Gerardo, NED tuvo el honor de apoyar este programa y realmente nos sentimos muy satisfechos de su resultado y para nosotros ha sido, digamos, un esfuerzo conjunto que valoramos muchísimo, ya que tanto nuestro trabajo desde el programa de América Latina como el trabajo de Freedom House en el área de América Latina se complementan mucho y ambos tenemos un énfasis bastante marcado en los temas de derechos humanos y por lo tanto pues consideramos que esta asociación ha sido sumamente necesaria y fructífera y ha producido un reporte muy sólido. Esto forma parte de un proyecto más amplio, que no solamente incluye América Latina, es un proyecto global, y la idea es que a través de la realización de los distintos reportes, distintos esfuerzos, lleguemos a algunas consideraciones que puedan servir como lecciones compartidas, como un conjunto de recomendaciones que puedan aplicarse no solamente para América Latina, sino para el globo, pues, para todos los países donde se está viviendo este proceso de degradación de la democracia y de retroceso en términos de derechos humanos. De modo que este esfuerzo en América Latina se complementa con esfuerzos en otros lugares del mundo y realmente creo que va a producir pues, resultados que van a tener mucha utilidad tanto para nuestra región como más allá. Como ya mencionó Nicole, es decir, si bien estamos viendo un deterioro global de la democracia, tenemos una realidad muy particular en América Latina. En primer lugar, pues como ya ella mencionó y otros han resaltado, América Latina hoy en día es el continente más peligroso para los defensores de derechos humanos y el peligro no solamente se refiere a amenazas, digamos, físicas o verbales, espionaje, intromisión en las actividades de los defensores de derechos humanos, sino que realmente significa poner en riesgo la vida de los defensores de derechos humanos, al punto que, como ya se dijo, 3/4 partes de los homicidios de derechos humanos que ocurren globalmente tienen lugar en América Latina. De modo que estamos enfrentando una verdadera crisis en términos de la capacidad que tienen los defensores de derechos humanos de llevar a cabo su labor con el mínimo de protección. Y hay otra condición de América Latina que realmente es alarmante, considerando este deterioro evidente de la seguridad de los derechos humanos, que es que en América Latina la infraestructura de protección de los defensores de derechos humanos es muy débil. Es decir, uno pensaría que en una situación de alta peligrosidad, alto riesgo, pues habría más elementos, una infraestructura más sólida para la protección y el libre ejercicio de esta actividad, y sin embargo no la hay. Es decir, hay muchas carencias desde el punto de vista de la prevención de los ataques, de la protección de los defensores de derechos humanos una vez que los ataques han ocurrido, y hay poca protección no solamente en términos de infraestructura física, sino poca protección legal, poca protección psicosocial y de acompañamiento y protección de la actividad. De modo que este informe pues, creo que contribuye mucho, en primer lugar, a detectar las debilidades y a través de las recomendaciones a tratar de superar esas debilidades. Por otro lado, en América Latina se está dando un proceso masivo de migración y buena parte de los migrantes son también defensores de derechos humanos, en particular en los casos más críticos de Venezuela y Nicaragua, y eso queda muy bien reflejado en los dos estudios de caso. De modo que creo que esa combinación de deterioro de las condiciones con una infraestructura débil de protección a los defensores de derechos humanos hacen que este informe sea más relevante aún. Quería resaltar un aspecto que me pareció muy importante del informe, que es que se está abordando a los defensores de derechos humanos ya no solo como víctimas o no exclusivamente como víctimas, sino como agentes de cambio. Creo que esa perspectiva es sumamente importante, queda muy bien reflejada en los dos casos de estudio cuando se ve pues cuál es uno puede apreciar y admirar el coraje de los defensores de derechos humanos, su compromiso, su búsqueda de protección para esa comunidad y obviamente para las víctimas, pero creo que esa visión de concebir a los defensores de derechos humanos como agentes de cambio y enfatizar su capacidad, su voluntad, su acción, su carácter proactivo en toda en esta problemática tan compleja, creo que es muy importante y agrega un elemento, digamos, conceptual y vamos a decir, de acción, que es muy importante para abordar estos problemas de manera sólida. Finalmente, creo que es muy importante, como ya se ha mencionado, que este tema sea abordado de manera comprensiva, digamos, global, que incluye coordinar los distintos actores relacionados con este tema, los gobiernos, los organismos como los nuestros, pues, donantes internacionales, los cuerpos orientados hacia la defensa de la democracia y derechos humanos que tenemos en el ámbito hemisférico y también en el ámbito global, movilizar a la sociedad civil, es decir, para generar una protección global y comprensiva a los defensores de derechos humanos es necesario movilizar todos estos actores, dada la, digamos, significativa, el significativo deterioro de la capacidad de acción, como digo, no solamente en América Latina, sino globalmente, pero en particular en América Latina. De modo que con eso, bueno, simplemente quiero concluir y agradecer nuevamente la invitación, felicitarlos por este esfuerzo y, bueno, decir que estoy muy pendiente de ver cuál va a ser el resultado de todo este esfuerzo global y creo que va a ser de enorme utilidad no solo para América Latina, sino más allá del continente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Miriam, really for pointing out and identifying that this particular issue not only is new, but that we have some findings in the report that are beginning to draw the contours of not only who the human rights defenders are, but some of these individual, collective, regional, and international dimensions. And on that note, we're very honored to have somebody who is monitoring constantly the plight of human rights defenders around the world. Mary Lawlor, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights. I want to thank her personally for making time in her busy schedule to be with us. And I will ask her to provide some remarks on the report that we're launching today. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to join today and for the report, which deals with the crucial question of what effective solidarity and support for human rights defenders at risk might look like. As the report rightly points out, human rights defenders are agents of change who build civil and just societies based on the rule of law. These are the people in communities all over the world taking peaceful action to see human rights realized and respected in practice. But as we all know, such action is exactly the kind which challenges power and its connected privileges, whether they be tied to political position, economic advantage, societal structures, or discriminatory hierarchies. As such, defenders often find themselves particularly at risk. And this is true all over the world. And in Latin America, those risks have proved to be particularly persistent. In the first year of my mandate, from May 20 to May 21, I addressed 53 communications, that is formal letters asking states to respond to issues I had on human rights defenders, to states and other actors in the region, because we all know in the context of business and human rights, a lot of violations against human rights defenders take place. These statistics, while reflective of the challenges faced by defenders all over Latin America, also speak to the organization of defenders and civil society in the region, and the solidarity that has been shown with them by human rights organizations, both regionally and internationally. As Special Rapporteur, while I have been trying to be proactive and engage directly with as many human rights defenders as I can, I still rely to a large extent on people sharing information with me when defenders are at risk, whether that be the defender themselves or a group accompanying that defender. I couldn't have taken up the cases I did without the alert mechanisms that have been put in place by civil society, either within the defender's own countries or at the regional or international level being activated. So systems of support for human rights defenders in the region are in place, and the report attempts the important task of reflecting on them, in particular when it comes to solidarity being shown with defenders in exile. And this is something I need to learn more about. It asks some important questions. For example, what's under security and protection? There are questions that are relevant for states and international and regional human rights organizations, as well as people in positions like me. But it's my strong view that they can only be adequately answered by defenders themselves. In fact, it was the quotes from human rights defenders interviewed for the report that most struck me while reading it, on their needs, on their well-being, and on their difficulties. I receive a lot of information on the situation of defenders at risk in Venezuela and Nicaragua, but less about the situation of those who have needed to leave the country, those in positions with official responsibility and those in a position to help them need to listen when those questions are being answered by defenders and shape their support programs accordingly. This responsibility stands even though the answers are going to be complex. When I hear from defenders about the measures that have been granted to them by states to improve their security, time and time again, I'm told about the inappropriate nature of what's being offered and how the measures ultimately prove ineffective because the authorities don't engage in real consultation with the defenders themselves about the risks that they face, the context they are in, and the support that they need. And for those of us who are seeking to stand in solidarity with defenders, I think this is the real lesson. We need to keep learning from them, to keep listening to them. And for me particularly, to be listening to those defenders about the situation they find themselves in exile. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the launch and from learning from you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Those are really encouraging words for us and for the human rights defenders in particular. And we really thank you for your kind words. The report focuses also on the role of donors who have been at the front of supporting not only human rights, but also the human rights defenders themselves. And one of those donors has been the U.S. Agency for International Development. I'm very pleased to have a friend, a colleague, a former colleague, Peter Natiello, who is the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator at the Bureau of Latin American and Caribbean at USAID. Peter, welcome, and thanks for making time of your busy schedule to say some words on this report.
Thanks so much, Gerardo. It's great to be on today, and a very special hello to our human rights defenders that are on the line and that are participating in this important event today. Special thank you to Nicole and to Freedom House, to you, Gerardo, for inviting me to speak on behalf of USAID's Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean today. USAID really is proud to partner with Freedom House to advance our shared interests in human rights and the democratic rule of law in the region. We've been partners for many years, and I really can't think of a more important moment to be working together to defend democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean. The numbers that Nicole shared with us in her intervention earlier, I think really bear out that this is a more important moment than ever to be working together on these critical issues. It's great too to be on with such a distinguished group of representatives of the National Endowment for Democracy, the United Nations, civil society, and academia. Again, I want to thank Freedom House for being just a key leader and a key partner in so many places where democracy and liberty are under threat. For example, in Venezuela, where Freedom House and USAID work together to support civil society and independent media, monitor human rights abuses and conditions in the country, and help citizens demand serious elections that meet international standards. Through this shared commitment, just hundreds of human rights defenders have gained the skills and the resources to act as watchdogs of the regime's myriad violations against its citizens and basic civil and political rights. But just as important as the skills they've gained is just the hope that Freedom House, USAID, and all of us really on the line today impart to these brave people by being at their side at the most difficult of moments. We're grateful to Freedom House for its decades-long leadership in the region and for bringing information and dialogue together through events like this. Reports like the one being launched today really help drive our collective task to make a life-changing impact in the democracy and civil society space in Latin America. And reports like the one we launched today underscore the fundamental importance of democratic norms and basic principles of human rights in the region and around the world. The report advances and honors the universal values of freedom, liberty, and human rights, as well as the brave people that sacrifice for those ideals. Again, at USAID, we're so proud to be part of these efforts. And as the report points out, we can do more to protect tenacious frontline human rights leaders in the hemisphere. We need these individuals to help stem the crises facing democratic governance in Latin America. In the most recent Vanderbilt University Latin American Public Opinion Project, the America's Barometer Survey, 2/3 of the people in Latin America and the Caribbean agree that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. However, fewer than 40% said that they were satisfied with democracy. Those are the lowest numbers recorded since the survey began. And the numbers tell a sobering story. They remind us that what happens in the region affects our lives here in the United States and pulls at the diverse threads that connect us around the hemisphere. The Biden-Harris administration, certainly USAID, understand the urgent state of affairs. Our fulsome commitment to the hemisphere's challenges to strengthen governance, fight corruption, bolster the region's economy, safeguard human rights, and certainly work with our partners around the region to address the COVID crisis is rooted in shared democratic values. To that end, we're working every day to show that Latin American Caribbean nations that respect these values, that enshrine them in laws and defend them through strong institutions, do better by their citizens. The US government is working, as Secretary Blinken said recently in a speech he made in Quito, as Administrator Power has underscored many times, and it certainly was underscored at the recent Democracy Summit hosted by the Biden-Harris administration. We're working to ensure that democracy delivers. It's a top priority for us. As we move toward the Summit of the Americas in June, the issues of defending human rights and democracy will remain top shelf for the US government and around the region. The summit presents a unique opportunity to bring to bear the political will needed to expand regional cooperation and put our shared vision into action. USAID's firm commitment to addressing democratic governance in the hemisphere is demonstrated in part by its support for courageous human rights advocates and activists in oppressive environments that have experienced closing civic space or endemic corruption. In Nicaragua, USAID's programming seeks to sustain longer-term nonviolent democratic activism, foment a democratic culture, and protect human rights and civil liberties. In Cuba, one of the most repressive countries in the world, USAID support strengthens Cuban civil society and human rights groups, including religious and labor rights activists. It provides access to information for Cubans through independent outlets, and it provides humanitarian assistance to victims of political repression and their families. While the deteriorating human rights situation in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela present a massive challenge, we're working across the region to support civil society and independent watchdogs to deter human rights abuses and support vulnerable populations affected by violence and insecurity. For example, in Central America, USAID helps promote early warning and protection systems for key vulnerable groups, including human rights activists and journalists. And in Colombia, USAID is supporting the registration of vulnerable Venezuelans under temporary protective status and increasing migrant access to Colombian health, education, and justice services and economic opportunities. As these and other examples show, democracy and human rights are through lines in all of USAID's work in the region. We're meeting the moment in Latin America and the Caribbean because we know that a robust civil society and citizen-responsive governance built for and with everyday people is central to democracy and the key to defending and improving it. We stand in partnership with the people of Latin America and the Caribbean to advance a more values-driven, democratic, and prosperous hemisphere. And we stand with the communities we serve to ensure we're doing everything we can to make democracies deliver. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak today. Back to you, Gerardo.
Thank you, Peter, for your remarks and certainly for supporting human rights defenders throughout Latin America. Now it's time to start unpacking perhaps some of the most important findings of the report and the case studies. And we assembled a very interesting panel. I would like to just say something about one of our panelists who was invited and she accepted the invitation, Antonio Rejola, who, as you know, was the former president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and an expert in her own right. She recused herself because, as most of you know, she's now the new foreign minister of the new government in Chile. And so in that role, of course, it's understandably that and now she's very busy putting the inauguration of the new government. But nonetheless, we have with us a great panel. And I'm going to start with Jonathan Iloth, who currently is a program manager at the American Bar Association, the Latin American and Caribbean program. But he was one of the many researchers that Nicole mentioned that work in this report. And so welcome, Jonathan. And I'd like to start by asking you, as one of the researchers of this regional assessment, what would you say are the top three findings, in your opinion, of the report and why?
Good morning, Gerardo. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Bueno y buenas tardes. I would be remiss, first of all, Gerardo, if I did not also express my gratitude for the really tremendous assistance that I received from my colleagues, both at Freedom House and my co-researcher with this undertaking. It was a very significant undertaking, and I very much appreciated her assistance in this regard. In terms of our top 3 findings, I would say, first and foremost, Gerardo, there was, we found in our study and our interviews and just speaking at length with people that there really is a need for holistic approaches toward protection. Human rights defenders are frequently calling for holistic protections of their integral security. Integral security that goes beyond physical security to include medical, psychosocial, and psycho-emotional. And civil society organizations, in addition, are calling for state protection mechanisms, if they do exist, are often limited and focus solely on physical security or physical safety, and often are not appropriate to the context or to that specific human rights defender. Protection for human rights defenders is a right and treatment for insecurity, and it's increasingly being viewed by regional protection organizations, national protection organizations, and international protection organizations as a bundle of protections, not solely physical security. So there was a really great quote of a woman I interviewed who had cited her Guatemalan colleague by saying, "Protection is a right and security is a strategy." And I thought that was really poignant and right on point for the study. There's a need for an assessment of looking specifically at the local context, that not one size fits all for protection mechanisms for human rights defenders. And there's a need to include and encompass collective and not solely individual protection mechanisms, rather looking at it from the perspective of the community. And there's also increasing demand for civil society organizations and human rights defenders for legal and psychosocial services. Unfortunately, the demand for these services in many countries exceeds the supply for legal and psychosocial or psycho-emotional services. And then finally, I would say for holistic protection, that there was an emphasis among human rights defenders that we interviewed that there should be an emphasis on preventative measures, not looking solely at protection, but that the state is responsible for ensuring a duty to prevent such occurrences from happening, such as threats or assaults or assassinations. 2 other findings, Gerardo, that I would mention involve relocation initiatives, both temporary and permanent relocation initiatives. First and foremost, that there's a need for an involvement or coordination of local actors, local civil society organizations, and the human rights defenders themselves. We found when interviewing people that most successful relocation initiatives tend to be those that are tied to local in-country partners, whether they are civil society organizations or national protection organizations. These entities or these organizations can verify information. They can recommend specific actions on behalf of the human rights defender. They can establish and maintain contact with the human rights defender. And most importantly, they can account for the human rights defender's family, their community, that particular human rights defender's gender or gender identity, their culture, and then their socioeconomics. There's also a need to include the full participation of human rights offenders throughout the entire process, right, of making that decision to relocate internally, to relocate temporarily outside the country, or permanently in a request for asylum or refugee status. That entire process and those decisions need to involve the human rights defender. And then finally, I would say in terms of relocation initiatives, whether again temporary or permanent, there's a need for holistic approaches in relocation initiatives as well, not solely in forms of protection. So we found that there's a dearth of services across the board, but there really a magnitude of services are needed and often not provided for human rights defenders who are forced to temporarily relocate outside their country. And what we heard from human rights defenders was that what they really needed upon relocation was accompaniment, full accompaniment, whether that's temporary or permanent. They need assistance with integration into the host country, the social services aspect, whether it's a language issue, but also really important and significant for human rights defenders is the need for well-being or medical care when they are temporarily relocated. It may also include immigration services, such as obtaining status, even if it's temporary status, and the need for work authorization. There's also the question of whether or not the human rights defender may want to continue his or her work in their home country, being based abroad temporarily. And that is really sort of a decision of the human rights defender, because it may be in his or her best interest to take a respite from their work. And I would just say finally, Gerardo, that given the levels of trauma that human rights defenders experience, well-being care and services are essential and needed, and they need to be included in relocation initiatives. In many of the programs that we talk to, this is happening, but across the board, there is a dearth for this service and for this initiative to be incorporated into these programs.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that first look at some of the most important findings in your opinion. I want to remind, before I move to our next panelist, that you can start putting your questions in the chat. That's going to be our next segment in this particular program. And one of the things that I think the report does is, and it's right there in Annex 3, it maps really the number of organizations that are working in support and defending human rights offenders. In itself, that is a very important finding of the report. And one of the groups that specifically are in aggregate thought as human rights offenders are journalists. And this is one of the reasons why we invited Dr. Celeste Gonzalez Bustamante, who is the director of the Center for Border and Global Journalism at the University of Arizona. There is an element of transnationality. I think Mary was mentioning that this new concept of human rights offenders in exile is an important one, and who better to kind of begin to kind of point to certain tendencies is Dr. Gonzalez Bustamante. I want to ask you, what findings do you think are relevant in the regional and the case studies that are relevant to the work of the center that you direct, and specifically to the work of journalists across borders as human rights defenders themselves?
Bueno, muchas gracias, Gerardo, por esa pregunta y por la invitación, por estar aquí con ustedes para mí esta mañana. I'm going to switch to English because I had prepared my remarks in English, but it's really an honor to be with all of you today. The Center is the Center for Border and Global Journalism, which has been around since 2015, is very committed to human rights issues, improving human rights for journalists and others around the world. And it's something that we are looking at through our research, through our outreach, and in some cases training. And I will say that the report is a tremendous contribution to helping us understand what is happening in the region, this region that many have already said, the most dangerous region for human rights defenders, and one of the most dangerous regions for journalists. And in Mexico is the most dangerous country in the world for journalists at this particular moment in time. And that just this month, 3 journalists, perhaps more journalists, have been killed in Mexico alone, where on average, a journalist a month is killed, unfortunately. So this report and its findings are of particular interest and relevance for the work that we do at the center. And I will just point out a few things, Gerardo and others who are listening. First of all, I want to say that a lot of the findings coincide with what we have found regarding journalists in Mexico. This very, the transnational part of what is happening in terms of exiled journalists, I think is very, very important in terms of how we maybe reflect on the findings and where we go with them, because I think that in terms of how support is set up, support tends to be focused on the citizens of particular countries, and that is a limitation. And so we see that this is the issue of journalists and other human rights defenders who are being threatened and attacked. Really, this is an issue of migration now. So that really struck me about this report. The findings are connected to the work that we've done in terms of, as I mentioned, the research training and some of the visibility efforts that we've done. And I will just say, I think that in terms of the case studies, the case study about Nicaraguan journalists who are seeking refuge in Costa Rica is of particular importance. For example, we're now trying to, we're starting a project with the Worlds of Journalism project, which is a project that looks at countries, more than 100 countries around the world, and it's now in its third round, and we will be looking at, for the first time, looking at journalists in Costa Rica, which is an outlier in the region in terms of its level of human rights protections and also the press freedoms. It's even ranks much higher than the United States and is usually up in the top 10, as many of you all probably know. And that fact that many Nicaraguan journalists are looking and seeking refuge in Nicaragua makes us really kind of rethink how we are going to do this research in Costa Rica, trying to analyze and look at the conditions for journalists in Costa Rica. We have to now consider this very transnational aspect, and I would love to continue conversations with Wendy about what she's doing in Costa Rica. So some amazing work. And so in short, I just wanted to, on that question, Gerardo, just emphasize the very transnational nature of all of this and how this is really a transnational problem, therefore requires transnational responses in order to kind of affect change.
Thank you, Celeste. Indeed, I mean, there is a lot of elements of transnationality in this issue, and certainly one of the key recommendations of the report is to continue to dig deeper, basically, in this particular issue. So, thanks for your thoughts on that. We wanted to also make sure that the actors of this report, the main actors, the main focus of this report, the human rights defenders, had a voice as we also interview them and we actually listen to their stories. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that we have a very special guest with us today, who is herself a human rights defender, an activist in her own right, and her story is powerful. So Wendy Flores is a human rights defender, and her story is just so compelling about not only the challenges that human rights defenders face in their own countries, but also what happens when they are actually forced to exile. So Wendy, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros hoy. Y quería preguntarte básicamente, ¿qué es lo que más te ha llamado la atención o qué es lo más preocupante cuando tú tienes que tomar una decisión de salir del país y pues por el trabajo que estás haciendo en defensa de los derechos humanos? Gracias por estar con nosotros y dinos un poco de tu historia.
Gracias, Gerardo. Y primero que todo quiero agradecer por este valioso informe que lo recibimos con mucho cariño porque de verdad revela y refleja la realidad de defensoras y defensores de derechos humanos que nos ha tocado estar fuera de nuestros países, de nuestras casas, de nuestros hogares, de nuestras familias, y que nos ha impactado en lo personal sobre todo. Quiero también empezar diciendo de que, bueno, yo salí en diciembre de 2018 de Nicaragua, salí por veredas, por puntos ciegos, les decimos nosotros, y esto representa uno de los principales desafíos, es la situación de seguridad. ¿Cómo salen los defensores y las defensoras? En realidad enfrentando los riesgos, saliendo como que si estás en una situación de que has cometido un delito, como que has cometido un crimen y vas huyendo. Y en realidad esta huida representa para defensores y defensoras la posibilidad de continuar con vida, la posibilidad de continuar con libertad. No es la típica salida de una persona que probablemente emigra por un trabajo y se logra despedir de sus familias. No, aquí no hay tiempo para despedirse de nadie. Y eso lo refleja el informe que hoy está publicando Freedom House. Realmente pasamos mucho tiempo pensando en la temporalidad del exilio, es decir, será por un mes, será por 3 meses, voy a regresar a mi país, y nos venimos dando cuenta que para el caso de Nicaragua esto no ha sido posible porque la represión ha sido intensa, permanente, se mantiene, y esta misma pregunta que me hago yo, se la han hecho todos y todas con las que hemos tenido contacto al continuar realizando una labor de defensoría del exilio. Hemos escuchado historias de otras defensoras que nos dicen, y defensores, incluyendo periodistas, vengo por un mes, y la realidad nos va imponiendo otra situación, es que nos vamos quedando más tiempo porque la represión aún continúa. Entonces, ¿qué desafíos nos encontramos? Bueno, nos encontramos en integrarnos en un país que no es el nuestro, empezar a reestructurar, a reconfigurar nuestras vidas personales, que además se ven marcadas por la separación de parejas, de hijos o hijas y demás familiares, del trabajo mismo, por lo que puedan decir las otras personas respecto de los que salimos, huyeron, nos dejaron solos, la lucha está aquí, expresiones y comentarios que realizan otras organizaciones que finalmente nos afectan también. Y es que vamos viviendo junto con las salidas un duelo interno, un sentimiento de pérdida, de que dimos todo o que pusimos en peligro incluso a nuestras familias por una labor que veníamos realizando desde quizás hacía mucho tiempo. Entonces, trabajar, por ejemplo, con los defensores y defensoras en varias cosas de las que aquí han compartido expertos y expertas, que tiene que ver con la protección, pero no solamente física, no solamente es resguardar la integridad personal o la libertad, también la seguridad emocional, la seguridad mental, también la seguridad económica incluso, porque se ha perdido todo cuando uno sale de su país y va dejando todo. Y quiero decir, bueno, que antes de la salida de un defensor o defensora ya han ocurrido situaciones de amenazas, de detenciones, de persecución, de criminalización. Entonces uno ya viene arrastrando toda una vivencia de violencia, probablemente política, que pasa por nuestros cuerpos, que pasa por nuestra salud mental, y nos encontramos a un exilio que realmente pues cada vez más se van abriendo como más oportunidades, pero que estas informaciones necesitan ser recibidas, y la protección además que la comunidad internacional puede ofrecer por las defensoras y los defensores que salimos. Quiero también mencionar que los países tienen la responsabilidad de apoyar también a los defensores y defensoras que salen. No solamente garantizar pues la protección, sino crear pues estos mecanismos que puedan ayudar o contribuir al restablecimiento personal. Una de las acciones pues que a mí en lo personal me ha ayudado y a todo el equipo con el que actualmente me encuentro es poder continuar defendiendo derechos humanos desde el exilio, lograr una articulación con otras organizaciones, con otras redes, con otros espacios que puedan ampliar nuestras voces. Es una satisfacción personal, es no sentir, por ejemplo, que la dictadura cumplió con su cometido de tratar de acabar o terminar con los defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos, el crear el colectivo de derechos humanos Nicaragua Nunca Más, organización a la que pertenezco, nos ha permitido continuar con nuestros proyectos de vida que estaban siendo truncados y no es que todavía estemos totalmente satisfechos. La necesidad de retornar a nuestro país es permanente, lo deseamos desde el corazón, de nuestra alma, de nuestros pensamientos. Vivimos con el cuerpo en Costa Rica, pero nuestra mente y nuestro corazón en Nicaragua, siguiendo día a día lo que ocurre en nuestro país y el continuar recibiendo denuncias de otras víctimas que no tienen opciones tal vez para ser escuchados o documentados y el que podamos trasladar a la comunidad internacional lo que sigue ocurriendo en nuestro país y ser una voz fuera de Nicaragua y aportarle a nuestro país, creo que nos ayuda como defensores y defensoras a poder seguir en esta contribución que nuestro país necesita para el restablecimiento de la democracia, de la justicia, de las libertades, el que podamos vivir en un país libre y que no tengamos pues nunca más dictadura. Entonces esto creo que es muy importante. Lo hemos visto no solamente con defensores y defensoras, lo hemos visto con periodistas, que periodistas puedan hacer su labor en espacios seguros. Es tan importante también como que los defensores y defensoras lo puedan continuar realizando y que sientan pues que todo lo que dieron, e incluso poner en riesgo a sus propias familias en el país de origen, pues realmente no haya sido en vano, sino que pues puedan seguirlo haciendo articuladamente o reforzando las capacidades y viendo las salidas como oportunidades también para continuar siendo agentes de cambio. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, Wendy. Y vamos a tener la oportunidad de continuar un poco con algunos de los elementos que tú mencionaste. Thank you. And we're already getting a lot of questions in the Q&A. And in fact, actually, I would like to ask Jonathan, if he can, one question that was asked by one of our participants, which kind of was related to the question that I have prepared, but this is a little bit more specific. And what particular findings in the report speak to the differentiated impact on human rights defenders who are women, LGBT, or indigenous? Is there a difference in this particular, and I think we call it intersectionality, I think, with the report. Can you speak a little bit on that in some concrete terms, Jonathan, please?
Sure. It's an excellent question, and thank you for asking it. It was one of the aspects that we addressed in our study and in our assessment, and what we heard from the individuals we interviewed, whether it was a protection organization or a human rights defender, him or herself, that there was a need and there was a dearth of approaches that incorporated intersectionality, right? So that there was a need for intersectionality in relocation initiatives, both temporary and permanent. And we saw that in our conversations with national protection organizations and international protection organizations, that they were sort of addressing the needs of LGBT individuals and women, but there was a particular dearth in services or approaches for Afro-descendant populations or Afro-descendant human rights defenders or Indigenous individuals or Indigenous communities. We often saw, for example, with Indigenous communities or Indigenous human rights defenders, that really an assessment is needed as a community approach in assessing what is best for that human rights defender, what is best for that community, and what actions should be taken collectively and not solely individually, and definitely not solely by the decision of a international organization as opposed to the human rights defender and the Indigenous communities themselves.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, I see Mary, and factually, I mean, because this is a question for her specifically, I will go back to Celeste and to Wendy in a second, but there is a participant that has asked a question specifically of you, Mary, and if you want to add anything else to what we are conversing, please free to do so. And the question specifically to you is whether you have planned a visit in 2022 to either Venezuela or Nicaragua, even not as an official visit, but perhaps in an academic dimension. And that's a question that was asked in the Q&A. Go ahead, Mary.
So first of all, if you don't mind, I'd like to just say something about women, LGBTI and Indigenous. And as Jonathan was talking about how you have to look at, you know, different, the intersections, the way things overlap. So, for example, an Afro-descendant Indigenous woman, human rights defender, you have race, you have Indigenous, you have woman, and then if it's on the environment, you have land. So you have to look at all those things when you're considering the protection mechanism that is needed. And I fully echo what Jonathan was saying about talking to the community and talking to the individuals concerned, and that a collective approach to holistic protection and security is needed. And indeed, I've spoken to defenders from Latin America, hundreds and hundreds from all the countries in all different, coming from different areas that they defend. So for example, with LGBTI defenders, where there is a huge discrimination and culturally where they're criminalized and discriminated by society as well. So that is an extra kind of challenge that has to be looked at how to defend them, you know. So I mean, it is all there's no doubt about it, it is all very difficult, but all I can keep coming back to, because I've been doing this work for over 40 years, and I've seen Latin America when it was full of military dictatorships, and bit by bit, you know, the dictatorships in many cases were got rid of. And yes, of course, you know, things aren't great now, but countries go up and down. And I do believe that the strength of the human rights movement in Latin America, it'll never be extinguished. And I even see it with Indigenous human rights defenders now, where as part of this collective holistic security and protection, they are bringing their children into it at an early stage to try and make sure that the Indigenous culture and spiritual values remain. So sorry, I've just I had to say that, but the actual question, am I going to come to Latin America? Well, I don't know yet, because, you know, the UN has, first of all, there's no country visit. So I don't think there'll be a country visit. But of course, I would be happy. And I've been to a few countries in Latin America in my last job, but I would be happy to go to some unacademic visits. Indeed, I was invited for World to go to a UNESCO Honduras and somewhere else, but sadly I'm already committed at that time. But yes, it's the answer. I mean, I'm happy to look at where I can go. I am at a disadvantage. I don't speak Spanish, but I have people on the team that speak Spanish. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. We continue to have questions. I think we're slowly making the transition to the last part of the launching event, which is the Q&A. And I have a question specifically for Celeste, just to follow up. I think the assessment highlights, as an example, the journalists and how they developed several tools to protect and defend themselves. For example, we highlight the Journalists in Distress Network, GID, I think it's the acronym, as a model, for example, for coordinating efforts among key organizations. But also, particularly you that are right there in the border, there's this other reality in a sense that, for example, in Mexico, journalists have been killed, in the thousands since the year 2000, and yet many human rights defenders not only have to cross this insecure place, perhaps going into the border or into the United States, but also seeking refuge in Mexico. So the question is, first of all, is there any tools in that particular ecosystem of border defense and security that you have seen? And also, how do you reconcile the insecurity that you have in this huge country in Mexico in relation to human rights defender transit?
Thank you, Gerardo, for those questions. It is a bit of a conundrum, the second question, which I'll get to after I take on the first one, which is how we have seen journalists working together across borders. And that's, I guess, if you will, somewhat of a bright spot of what we have seen in our research and just throughout our experience in the region, even prior experience as journalists. And so, yes, the work of the Journalists in Distress Network, if that could be strengthened, that would be something that we would certainly encourage. Through our research, in Mexico in particular, we've seen, and this has happened in other parts of Latin America, getting to Mary's point of civil society and human rights defenders movements being quite strong in some cases in Mexico. And so what we have seen is the really proliferation and the emergence of dozens of networks, local, regional, and national in Mexico. And so you have groups like Periodistas de a Pie at the national level, working with these other state and regional networks, and they have banded together to support themselves in all kinds of ways through training, through creating visibility about different attacks that might be occurring in different regions of the country in Mexico. And for example, when the 3 journalists were killed just this month, you had protests throughout the country. I think if I'm not mistaken, some 27 out of 32 states in Mexico. And so that is somewhat of a bright spot, the emergence of all of these networks. And I think that they have been able to have at least create visibility. Unfortunately, they are not it's such a complicated issue. The killings, I guess, is what I'm getting at. It continue, but the fact that these networks have emerged and that they are able to train each other so that they are able to protect themselves by producing journalism and working. Some of the training deals with sources and how to manage sources, so you're not making, putting your sources out in making them more vulnerable, about how to protect sources and yourself as a journalist. They've shared that kind of information. We have seen, in particular on the US-Mexico border, for example, where journalists work with journalists on the Mexican journalists work with journalists on the US side, and that has offered some protection for both all of those journalists who are sometimes will go to sensitive crime scenes together, and sort of like safety in numbers. So US journalists team up with Mexican journalists to go to crime scenes. We've seen that in our research. Sometimes in cases where the news outlet has been threatened, they will publish the actual printed version of the newspaper in the United States. In San Diego, for example, Zeta magazine publishes in San Diego and then provides the newspaper to its readers in Tijuana. Sometimes information is shared north to the colleagues in the United States who can print that information and publish that information digitally. And then the Mexican counterparts and colleagues can publish it after it's been published in the United States to offer another level of protection. So there's some really interesting things that we've seen in terms of how journalists band together. I would say that much of this is highly localized. So what works in one region is perhaps would put people at risk in another region. So it's highly so geographic. The geography matters in all of these different regions. Getting to your second question, Gerardo, about this conundrum of Mexico being one of the most dangerous place in the world for journalists, and then at the same time you have human rights defenders going to Mexico to seek refuge. It's something that we have actually seen in our own research, where journalists on the extreme periphery, what we call the extreme periphery of Mexico, working in these very small markets with very little support from even their own media outlets, having economic conditions where they're being paid such meager wages and very little support politically, they are forced to leave their communities and go to Mexico City, which offers a little bit of a more protection, because Mexico City, for various reasons, is more safe for them, because it's, number one, they kind of get lost in the 22 or more million people who are there, versus a small town where everybody knows everybody, and everybody, even if their name is not published in a news outlet or a news article, everybody knows who that journalist is, right? Whereas if you go to Mexico City, there might be more economic opportunities. You would also be perhaps connected to some of these organizations and networks that I mentioned that offer support to journalists. And then you are also at the political seat of power, where theoretically you would have some protection and ability to get more resources and help. But it is somewhat of a conundrum in Mexico, Gerardo. Those are great questions, and something that we should continue to look at.
Of course, certainly. Thank you, Celeste. Yeah. I mean, we are officially in the Q&A now, so I want to go to Wendy, and first of all, acknowledge some of the questions that are coming from our audience. Antonio Ponce, for example, was the one who asked about Mary's visit to Latin America. There's another question which I'd like to ask Wendy, and I'm trying to read here, so we have a specific question for you. First of all, there is a comment that has come, which I think is very pertinent, and relates a little bit to the question that I had for Wendy. It's the following. La pregunta tenía que ver obviamente con el tipo de apoyo que podría dar la comunidad internacional a los defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos en exilio. Y hay una pregunta específica en términos de los indígenas, en particular los defensores y defensoras indígenas, enfrentan una discriminación también por el idioma, por la lengua, dice la participante. Entonces, tú que estás empezando a tener estas redes, por ejemplo, en Costa Rica, ¿qué tipo de protección existe para acompañar esas necesidades, en especial los pueblos misquitos? Esa es una pregunta para ti, Wendy. La otra que quisiera preguntarte específicamente, que también es para ti, es, estoy buscando acá la pregunta, déjame ver, dice que muchas veces los procesos y mecanismos internacionales para investigar estos crímenes contra los defensores de derechos humanos, además el apoyo de otros países, pueden demorar y no responder en un tiempo adecuado. ¿Cuáles son algunos pasos o acciones específicos que otros países, tal vez Estados Unidos o Costa Rica, pueden tomar ahora? Entonces son dos preguntas sobre la base de tu experiencia. Uno, el tema de la lengua indígena y si hay definitivamente mecanismos de protección. Y la segunda tiene que ver obviamente con acciones concretas para no demorar esa ayuda que en muchos casos a veces se presenta como urgente para los defensores y defensoras. Adelante, Wendy.
Gracias, Gerardo. Y bueno, solo puedo decir de que la inserción en Costa Rica a veces no es tan sencilla, pero hay una comunidad nicaragüense muy grande y entre los nicaragüenses como que nos hemos acercado. Hay grupos, por ejemplo, que se han organizado por departamentos como Masaya, Carazo. En el caso de las comunidades indígenas, está el bloque Costa Caribe de Nicaragua, y este bloque Costa Caribe de Nicaragua trata de estar promoviendo como sus costumbres. Están organizando, por ejemplo, comidas típicas de la costa, bailes. No podría decir si algo relacionado con la lengua, pero sé que es difícil acá decir de que hay información, pues, de que haya un lugar que esté ofreciendo para las comunidades indígenas que tengan los niños y las niñas opción de continuar aprendiendo, conociendo con su misma lengua, pero creo que sí, que valdría la pena que los que se han organizado entre sí puedan retomar como sus propias costumbres. Es valiosísimo, y que la comunidad internacional o el país de destino pueda facilitar medios, programas, de alguna manera ayudarles a que sus raíces no se pierdan, será fundamental, porque sin el apoyo de la comunidad internacional o del país de destino, esto no va a ser posible o va a ser mucho más difícil. Sobre acciones incluso transnacionales, represión transnacional, que es uno de los ejes que menciona el informe, nosotros lo hemos vivido como nicaragüenses acá en Costa Rica, exiliados y exiliadas que han sufrido amenazas de operadores políticos del actual régimen, o de fuerzas paraestatales, o personas que han venido acá y han cometido atentados también contra otros exiliados, y en los que se requiere de una investigación de parte, al menos en el caso de Costa Rica, que es donde estamos, de una investigación profunda que pueda determinar quiénes son las personas que están cometiendo estos actos, porque finalmente el país de destino es el país que está recibiendo a los exiliados y exiliadas y tiene una obligación de protección. O sea, la persona que sale de su país viene buscando protección, y esta protección internacional pues también tiene que incluir las investigaciones de carácter penal que se deban realizar frente a un acto de agresión en el país de destino. Creo que es muy importante que las organizaciones, las activistas, los defensores logren conectar con las instituciones del Estado que los recibe, en el caso de Costa Rica, que pueda haber una interacción fluida. Hemos visto, por ejemplo, cómo algunos grupos han podido realizar o continuar realizando su labor. En el caso de nosotros como defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos lo hacemos para Nicaragua, pero no ejercemos. Yo soy abogada y yo no ejerzo en Costa Rica, porque Costa Rica tiene sus propios procedimientos, sus colegios, y aunque probablemente haya una ruta, sabemos que es muy difícil. Los periodistas hacen también una labor acá, pero igual siempre enfocada para Nicaragua. Nosotros lamentamos mucho, por ejemplo, que los médicos y las médicas no hubieran podido realizar una labor en Costa Rica realmente, principalmente cuando había necesidades con una pandemia terrible. Y hubieron más de 20 médicos en Costa Rica. No puedo decir si aún se mantienen acá, pero sabemos que algunos han retornado y han decidido encerrarse en sus casas en Nicaragua a pesar del riesgo, y hay otros que todavía se mantienen acá, pero el ejercicio de la medicina acá no ha sido posible para ellos, o estudiantes de medicina, de derecho, que no pudieron continuar sus estudios porque los costos económicos son muy altos. Entonces, estas también son como consecuencias que se vienen arrastrando y que no hay políticas ni en el país receptor ni de la comunidad internacional que pueda pues ayudar a que haya como una interrelación o una conexión con quienes están viniendo hacia Costa Rica. Pero sí, pues hay que siempre buscar como las formas y las fórmulas para que haya esta relación que es necesaria para dar respuesta sobre todo a una comunidad de nicaragüenses que está acá y que es muy grande.
Gracias, Wendy. Hay varias preguntas y sé que estamos ya al borde del tiempo, pero he condensado un poco lo que han escrito los participantes. Son 4 temas específicos que hay que responder, obviamente. Uno tiene que ver con la relación de COVID-19 y el tema de defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos. Y hay una pregunta específica relacionada a Cuba. No sé si Jonathan o quisieras tomar esa pregunta. Esa es una, sobre la relación del COVID-19 y el tema de los defensores de derechos humanos. Hay otra pregunta sobre el tema de ataques digitales, digital attacks. What is the impact of this and whether we document this in the report? Is another question. There's another very interesting question which the report begins to kind of see the tip of the iceberg, which is the issue of shelters in Latin America, like the one that we described in Costa Rica, and whether we found any other experiences, particularly in the South, as opposed to in Mesoamerica. And the fourth one specifically has to do with a specific country, which is Honduras. And the participant basically says that the situation, the human rights situation in Honduras continues to deteriorate. And despite the fact that there is a new government, actually, human rights defenders are certainly afraid. So I don't know who wants to take in this maybe 10 minutes that we have some of the questions. Jonathan, are you prepared to take any of these questions? So
sure, I'm happy to address the question of the issues of COVID, of the pandemic, and how that's impacted human rights defenders.
Go ahead.
So, you know, this was a desk study, a desk assessment because of the pandemic. And so, first and foremost, we were not able to meet directly with the people we interviewed. We interviewed people virtually by and large. And I would say the impacts on, for example, on human rights defenders has been very significant, primarily with the imposition of state or local laws restricting the movement or imposing limitations on freedom of assembly, on freedom of speech, even on the ability to leave your house. There were restrictions on people needing to stay in their house. And I found, in our interviews that this across the board impacted human rights defenders, but I would also say particularly Indigenous human rights defenders in Indigenous communities who often act communally and act as a collective. And they were prohibited from meeting, many of their decisions are conducted in asamblea and an assembly, and they were not able to, those meetings were restricted. And then I think the ability for an individual to move within the country, right? So could that person seek protection inside the Capitol, for example? Was there a way to temporarily relocate that individual inside the country? All of that was restricted, right? Because of the pandemic, because of the health restrictions, sometimes under the guise of health restrictions, when really trying to limit the movement and assembly and speech of human rights defenders. And then clearly that impacted the individuals who had to flee, right? Were they able to go to a place that allowed, for example, there were restrictions on immigrants or asylum seekers or refugees seeking protection in another country. And then towards sort of like the end of the process, is across the globe, I would say restrictions on asylum have been applied rather vociferously. And you see a lot more people seeking asylum, but due to the COVID pandemic, having to wait either in another country, for example, what we do in the United States, having individuals wait and apply for asylum, but remain in Mexico for their hearings, and then just having their hearings or their petitions really extremely delayed.
Thank you, yeah.
Gerardo, can I just add a little bit to what Jonathan was saying as with respect to how this is impacting journalists? I think this is something that we should continue to look at in terms of human rights defenders, the impacts of the pandemic in all different ways. But just a couple of points, the pandemic has had huge implications for journalists who work in border regions for the reasons that Jonathan just mentioned. So the different types of restrictions for border crossing, these communities are not being covered the way that they should be, or the journalists are just limited and not being able to come into the United States for a long time, for example, to cover issues in the US. Mexican journalists were not allowed to come into the US. And in some cases, U.S. journalists did not want to, travel to Mexico, and so, but these policies that have been put in place throughout the region have been highly problematic for journalists who work in border regions. And then, secondly, journalists, of course, by the very nature of their work, must, and the best practices should be interviewing their sources in person and going to various different events or activities in person, and that limits, the pandemic has limited journalists in that way. In some cases, though, in Mexico, we've heard that journalists have been forced to cover issues and events in person and not being given the proper protection. So we've seen that dozens of journalists in Mexico, and this is a phenomenon throughout the region, have died because of being exposed to COVID-19.
Yes, definitely. And there's the issue basically also of the capacity of internet in some of these countries that actually prevent this instrument to be effective in terms of communication. Mary, do you want to say something specific about any of the questions?
Just to say, I echo everything that has been said, and I could talk all day about the impact of COVID on human rights defenders, but I'm not going to. But I am going to leave you with a request. What I have discovered in working with states, and I've spoken to lots of states in Latin America over the last year. Whenever I do a press release, they go to a lot of, and not only Latin America, other countries, They try and get me to stop the press release or to alter the press release or even the heading of the press release. The thing I found that they hate more than anything else is bad publicity. I mean, we all know this, but it has been totally reinforced to me since I took up this mandate. They care so much about their reputation and their international standing. So I would encourage you to keep trying to put out, even on Twitter, I mean, it's extraordinary the number of states who contact me because I say something on Twitter now, which is new for me. And actually, you know, I'm not good at that. But for example, one of the things you could usefully do now over the next week is the new Honduras, because we were saying something about Honduras. The new Honduran president has said that the Guapanal defenders, whose verdict is next week, he said in his, it was one of his priorities to see that they would be released. So the timing would be really good now if Freedom House and all the allies here could either write to him, tweet, ask for make sure that, you know, he's going to be held to what he said before he was elected. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Mary. Definitely. Certainly, I mean, you know, this topic is so new, and by the questions, you can tell that basically there is an agenda for the future. I think from Freedom House perspective, we start thinking about promoting, along with other partners, of course, regional dialogues. We hope that we could present both the Venezuela and the Nicaragua cases in person in Costa Rica and Colombia very soon, for example. And certainly the cases that we specifically highlighted are models to do this in other countries that are kind of working the same line as Venezuela human rights defenders and Nicaragua human rights defenders. And we're hoping that perhaps that could be part of the next phase of this particular process. I think the issue of digital attacks is something that you know, is so imperative. In as much as human rights defenders now have other tools, the governments particularly are ahead of them. And this is an area that we certainly will have additional conversations. And one question or two questions in particular, just to begin to round this up, because I know we're out of time. One is the issue of transnational repression. I think in our report, we documented 2 or 3 testimonial cases of human rights defenders being fearful that military forces from their host country crossed into their new host country to do damage. And as you know, Freedom House has a new report, Transnational Repression, the first one last year, kind of just through the very macro contrast in Latin America. We're hoping that this is also another topic of research in the agenda that will complement what the reports have found. And the issue of shelters, which is also another element that the report highlights. We pretty much map the 4 shelters that they are now available in Latin America. They're not enough. Some of them are very specific, targeting, for example, artists. Other, you know, don't take human rights defenders with families. Others do with. So certainly, Wendy's organization, for example, is one organization that we're going to continue to partner to start thinking about how to continue to strengthen, you know, these mechanisms to protect and defend human rights defenders, you know, in an integrated way. So. I do want to kind of, I'm mindful that, you know, we are out of time, but I want to let you know that the reports are already online for you to download. They are both in English and in Spanish. And certainly on behalf of Freedom House, I want to thank our panelists, I think, for your very insightful comments. Wendy in particular, because she herself is the voice of the human rights defenders. Certainly Mary, Miriam, Nicole, and Peter for having accompanied us. And I think we're starting a conversation, and we're going to be calling on you basically to help us continue this conversation and definitely, if we act in alliance and partnership, I think we want to make sure that the beneficiaries are being served and supported. Again, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again, either in Latin America or somewhere else. And thank you very much for helping us launch this report. Muchas gracias, la verdad, y que tengan un buen día. Muchas gracias.